Be back with you. Bart is in what is, as many of you know, an emotional day for parents. Is dropping his daughter Amelia off for her first year of school. She's up at Freed Hardeman, and so I don't know if he's still up there or if the emotional strain is such that he's unable to be here with us today. But he is asked me, or I volunteered to fill in for him while he was gone. Many of you thought you were rid of me, but I'm back. It's good to see you. I look forward to visiting with many of you in between class and worship and after worship. It's good. It really is good to see you. And being gone from a great place like this makes you realize even more how special this congregation and this place is. You got a good thing going here, and I miss you, and I miss being with you, and I'm glad to be back here with you for this class. We're in first. That's a great start, Drew. We're in the wrong place. We are in First Peter, chapter 2. And we are going to start in verse 11. 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 11. And I've asked Daryl to open us up in prayer. Nick came through for me in the clutch there. I don't have a printer at my new place. And so I sent an email to ask if somebody could print that off for me. And he did. Otherwise, I was going to be stuck there with my iPad that I don't normally use. Okay, 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. Now, Bart has started chapter 2 with you, and it is a great chapter. I mean, all the New Testament is great. But First Peter is a particularly great book, particularly great epistle, and chapter 2 is a great portion of that. Now, you left off last time with the great verse 9, I believe, and 10. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light, which in times past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which has obtained mercy, but now hath obtained mercy. We've been told by Peter, as Bart has mentioned in the previous classes, Peter is writing this to Christians who are about to enter a period of struggle, who are about to enter a period of persecution, and about to enter a period of difficulty. And Peter is writing to them to hold fast amid this period of difficulty. And he reminds them in the passages that you just read that they are different, that they are a peculiar people, that they are a chosen people, that they are a royal priesthood. And importantly, as we read, that they are to, the purpose of that is to show forth the praises of him that have called you out of darkness and into light. Having addressed us as those people, having identified who we are, that we are a special, a peculiar people, a royal people, Peter then transitions into some duties that are expected, some responsibilities that are expected of that royal priesthood, of that peculiar people, of that chosen people, and how we can do what is referenced here now that we are called out of darkness, how we can exclaim or show forth the praises of God in our life. There's going to be three ways that we talk about this morning. We'll probably talk about the first two more than the third. As you all know, I never can get through I'm supposed to get to the end of this chapter, and it became clearer and clearer to me as I was reviewing that I will once again fall short of getting to where I'm supposed to go. But there are essentially three things. This is a very practical passage, very practical. There are three ways in which we are, or positions or phases or areas of our life in which we are to exclaim the praises. We are to show the praises of God in our own life. First, the Christian pilgrim's relationship to the present world. That's the first section of scriptures that we'll talk about. Second, the Christian citizen's responsibility to the civil rulers and to the civil government. And third, the Christian servant's responsibility to his master. And we're going to get some practical guidance. Finally, we're given an image or an example of Christ, who is our example from whom we are supposed to follow after. Okay, so let's pick up in verse 11 of 1 Peter chapter 2. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Peter is encouraging the pilgrims and sojourners of this world to abstain from worldly lusts that war against the soul. Now, I like and I'm interested in the choice of words of pilgrim and sojourner. When I think of pilgrims, I think first of John Wayne. Now, I don't watch a lot of old westerns, but isn't he the guy who says, "Howdy, pilgrim"? Is that him or is that somebody else? Jack, you a western guy? Okay, well, I mean, I don't have a lot of John Wayne stature, I don't think. But, right, he says that to him, right? I don't know. I won't do it again. But I also think of the old Mayflower, right? When the pilgrims come to the New World, and you think of the first Thanksgiving and the Indians and the corn and the turkey and all that stuff. That's what I think of when I hear that. The word pilgrim means one who remains in a place but a short while as a traveler on a journey. Sojourner is not a word that I use very often, but it means one who lives in a foreign and a strange country. Now, I think this is great imagery, and I want to dwell on it here just for a little bit, another passage where it pops up. Because this is important imagery because you and I, we are, just as he's been talking about in those other passages, we're a peculiar people, a chosen people, a called out people. We are pilgrims and sojourners. Now, that is used also in Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 8. If you'll turn over there with me, Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 8. The same concept is sort of on the plaque of Abraham in the Faith Hall of Fame entry for Abraham. Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now we see Abraham in this great hall of fame for the faithful. And we see that he became, because he followed and was faithful to God, he became a sojourner. He left the land of his people. He didn't know where he was going, but by his faith in God, he went out. And he became a person dwelling as a foreigner in another land. And not just that, he became a pilgrim because he was searching for a different city. He was on a journey looking for a particular city. But Abraham was a sojourner and a pilgrim in more ways than his physical country, just because he left one place and went to another. And that's explained Hebrews 11, beginning of verse 13, talking about the other patriarchs and Abraham. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from which they came out, they may have had the opportunity to return. But now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly country. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Abraham and the patriarchs recognized that they were here on the earth strangers, sojourners, and pilgrims. Not just in the country they lived in, but in the earth itself. They were faithful to God and were able to turn loose of things like their homeland or the place that they had known or what everybody else was doing in society. They were able to turn loose of those things because they knew this place was not their home, that this earth was not their home, that they were only passing through on their way to a better country, a heavenly country, prepared for them by God. Now that's true not only for them, but of us. Philemon chapter 3, verse 20, we're told that our conversation or our citizenship is in heaven. Now, I just can't overemphasize what an important distinction this is for the Christian. We are a spiritual people with a spiritual home in heaven that we are striving like the patriarchs to get to. And we must understand that this physical world and the things that are in it is not our home. But we're strangers here. We are pilgrims on a journey towards heaven, passing through this mortal place. And that's not a distinction without a difference, as we see in the verses that follow. We're told to abstain from worldly lusts, which war against the soul. Abstain means here to constantly hold yourself back. Hold yourself back from fleshly lust. That is the evil desire for physical things. Think an evil desire for money or power or influence or sexual pleasure. We're told that those things, those physical things, fleshly lusts, war. That word war there meaning a constant, aggressive conflict. There is a constant war of those physical things with the spiritual part of us, our soul. Here, Peter discusses the real struggle between our spiritual nature and our physical surroundings and desires. Now, it matters that we're not at home in this physical world because we are a spiritual people with a heavenly home. And the physical things of this world, the physical nature of this world, wars against our soul. Jesus addresses this in the Sermon on the Mount in a long part in Matthew chapter 6. He notes to us that we shouldn't put our treasures here on earth. He contrasts physical treasures versus spiritual treasures. He says, don't put your treasures here on earth where moth and rust corrupts or thieves break in and steal. He says, put your treasures up in heaven. He contrasts the spiritual with the physical. He says, no man can serve two masters. You cannot serve God, the spiritual, and mammon, money, the physical. He says, don't think about the physical things, your clothes, your food. Don't put your stock or your time or your anxiety worrying about the physical things of this life. But do what? Seek first the kingdom of God and its righteousness. Now that's so important because the physical world is pulled before our eyes. It's what we see. It is all around us. The reminders and the temptations of the physical world is ever present. And if we're not careful as we sojourn, as we spiritual people sojourn as pilgrims through this foreign place, we'll get distracted. Because it's easy when all you can see is the material and the physical. It's easy to start to begin to desire those things as fleshly lusts. And it's easy to begin to make yourself at home here. And you begin to think about all the stuff that you want. The house that you want to live in. The car that you want to drive. The clothes that you want to wear. The places that you want to eat. The sports teams that you want to watch. And the politics and the news. And before long, the distractions of the physical world that's been pulled over our eyes distracts us. And we begin to look less like foreigners and more like the locals of the world. If the worldly lusts are winning, the soul is losing. And if we live like this world is our home, we will never have a home in heaven. And so Peter tells us that we must abstain from worldly lusts, which war against our soul. And not only that, but continuing with the metaphor here, and linking back to what Bart talked about last week, continue with the metaphor of being sojourners and pilgrims, people who are foreigners, who are different in the place that we are in. We not only are supposed to abstain from fleshly lust, but we should stand out in a positive way because of our conduct. We are to engage in godly conduct. We're told here that we ought to have a pattern of good works. Now this here, I thought this was really an interesting discussion of the language that is used here in terms of good works. It means more than moral rectitude, but includes that which is beautiful, harmonious, lovely, and symmetrical. Brother Guy in Woods, in his commentary, he notes that what is being discussed here in the way we're being told, living honestly before men, having our good works before men, Brother Guy in Woods says the meaning here connotes that we ought to live beautifully before others. The Christian ought to live beautifully. That means following righteous after God. That means loving each other, having kindness toward one another, not struggling or fighting with one another, but looking for peace. That means forgiving other people. That means being honest, having charity, giving to the people who are in need. Now, that's not only righteousness before God, but we're told here in this passage that it accomplishes two practical purposes. So the Christian will engage in beautiful living, righteous living, and will look different as a foreigner and a sojourner in the way that he lives his life. That's what Peter says that here. Now that has two practical consequences. That serves two practical purposes. First, facing the opposition, as these people were. They were under government scrutiny. They were under scrutiny. People were trying to blame stuff on the Christians during this period of time. If by living an exemplary life, it will work toward exonerating them from their accusers. If they're living a good life, an upright life, an honest life filled with good works, it exonerates them from their accusers. It gives the accusers nothing to hold on to. We see sort of a similar thought in Titus chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, where the young people are told that they ought to watch their mouth, they ought to watch their conduct, they ought to watch how they behave, that they ought to be grave and sincere, so that their enemies would be ashamed and have nothing evil to say about them. We have to behave that way in the world, and it keeps them from having something to hold against us, especially in this time of 1 Peter, when they're looking for something to pin on the Christian. And I'd say that still holds somewhat true today. Now, secondly, the other practical reason that Peter says here that we ought to live righteously, that we ought to live beautifully in the conduct that we have, is that we should not only live such lives so as to exonerate ourselves from the enemies who are trying to convict us, but according to Peter, our conduct ought to be such that it would bring glory to God. Now that reminds all of us probably of Matthew chapter 5, around verse 16, where we're told to let our light shine, right? That the people can see our good works, and in seeing our good works, it results in them glorifying the Father. And this goes directly back to the thought of you and I being a peculiar people, a chosen priesthood, and that we are living in such a way that proclaims the excellency of God, that we live in such a way that other people see us and recognize there's something different about that person, and I like it, and I want what they have. That's what's being said here. Now, it also brings up an important point that I've been giving a lot of thought to recently. You hear people say a lot of times, well, I don't care what other people think. I'm going to do what's right, and I don't care what anybody thinks. I don't care what that person says about what I am doing. Now, I understand that can be a useful sentiment, but I'm not sure that it's a biblical one, right? Matthew 7:12 is we sometimes call the golden rule: whatever you want men to do to you, do also unto them. Passages like that and this make it clear that it is the Christian's job to think about what your actions and your words and your conduct are causing other people to think and feel. In other words, it does matter what other people think. When people interact with you and with me, it matters how they come away from the interaction, right? If they come away from you feeling worse, feeling like you've been rough or hateful to them, if they feel brought down by their interactions with you, cheated by their interactions with you, you may say, oh, I don't care what they think, I did what was right. But Christians are to be empathetic, to be looking at what my conduct and my words are making another person think or feel, because we are to be living beautiful lives that cause not only to bring ourselves under the scrutiny of the government or an accuser, but also lives that cause other people to glorify God. And if you're not doing that, if you're not causing people to think that way, to feel that way, then brethren, you ought to care. You ought to care and try to do something better. My dad used to tell me, son, if you've got a problem with somebody, it might be them. If you've got a problem with everybody, it's probably you. And I think that's true. And so we've got to give some consideration as to how what we do make other people feel and think, because we are proclaiming the excellency of God as His chosen people, as His peculiar people, as the people who've been called out of darkness into the light, as pilgrims and sojourners here on the earth. Now, of course, remember, it's not easy in the best of times, but in this context, of course, these Christians are being brought under provocation. They're being brought under scrutiny. They're being accused and falsely accused, and so it's even more difficult there. Now, the day of visitation is mentioned. I don't really want to spend a lot of time on here because it doesn't really feel to me like it exactly matters what the answer to this question is. But what is the day of visitation? I ask a lot. People think a different thing. Could be the day of judgment. Could be a time of persecution. Could be the persecution of destruction of Jerusalem, etc., etc. The visitation here, the word is the notion of an inspection for any purpose. Inspection for punishment. You know, I'm looking at I'm looking down your test to see if you missed anything, and I'm going to put a big red X there. Or I'm looking through your test to see if you got any bonus points right. If you did good, I'm doing an inspection. Could be an inspection for good. Could be an inspection of. It could be inspection for punishment. Could be an inspection to confer a blessing on the obedience. Most of the people that I read about suggest it was the conferring a favor or blessing for the inspection. But at any rate, whatever that means, what's important is that when God inspects us, when God is looking, that we are behaving in this way and helping other people find the truth through our conduct. Okay, that's part one. The Christian, as a pilgrim and sojourners, responsibility to proclaim the excellency of God through our conduct in the world, as someone who stands out, as someone who is different, and as someone who behaves in a way that abstains from fleshly lusts, but also lives a beautiful life that is an example of the glory of God. Any comments on that first section? Oh, no. Okay. Time is fleeting from us. All right, 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 13. We'll read through verse 17. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, not using your liberty as a cloak of maliciousness, but as servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Here starts a different section. It is the Christian's responsibility to the government and civil rulers. And here Peter discusses a Christian's obligation to the civil government. Now, I've always been very interested in government. It is for better or worse. If you guys have college students who are thinking about majoring in political science, I did, and I don't recommend it. It's not very useful, and there was no job called political scientist, and so it was not my greatest idea to major in that. But I was interested in it and studied it for 4 years, and have for whatever it's worth, a piece of paper on my wall that says political science underneath it. I've worked in the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches of the Kentucky government, and I've worked in the judicial and the executive branches of the federal government. For most of my life outside of high school, I've been doing something in the government. I like to read about the government in my spare time. I like to follow politics in my spare time. Many of you who know me know I've got very strong political opinions. I'm not the only person who enjoys that sort of stuff. There are whole TV stations now that do nothing but politics, and even on stations that don't do just politics, there are all kinds of talk radio shows and TV shows that are just talking politics. Everybody's got an opinion about political parties, the governor, the president, both the current president and the one who's going to be elected. Many of us worry and get stressed out about who the next president is going to be, and who's going to be the next justices on the Supreme Court, and etc. Point number one under this topic about the government. It's important to remember that as much as we like the government, to think about the government, to talk about the government, maybe as much as we dislike the government, it's important to remember the government is a creation of man, and it is itself earthly. Peter uses the term ordinance of man. That's what it says in my old King James up here. It literally means the creation of man, to refer to the government. Now, this ties in directly to our prior point. We are pilgrims and sojourners here. Our primary concern are spiritual things related to the soul, the pursuit of heaven. The government affects our lives and is important. And it's good to pursue good laws. It's good to pursue good judges and leaders. But it is something it is something that is created by man, and it is earthly. So we shouldn't get too wrapped up in it. Even for me, who really likes it and has spent a lot of my time in it. I blame the media in a lot of ways for doing that to us. If you, depending on whether you watch Fox News or MSNBC, President Obama is running our country into the ground, and if we don't elect Trump soon, it'll all be, our country will be gone. Or if you watch the other channel, then surely we can't elect Trump, if we don't get Hillary Clinton in there, then our whole country will be ruined, and Trump would blow us all up with the nuclear codes, right? Depending on which channel you're watching, the end of the world is going to happen depending on which person that we elect. and if we don't elect the right person. To be honest with you, as much as I like politics, I can't watch that stuff very much, because it gets me all it gets me sort of like nervous about it and kind of keyed up about it. I get kind of too sucked in. Here's the reality: no matter whether Trump or Clinton is elected to be the leader of the country in which we are living, come November of 2016, God will still be on the throne in the place we are going. That's where our citizenship is. That's where we are pilgrims on our way towards. And that's the ruler that we really need to remember that we have. Now think back to Daniel chapter 2. I think you guys are studying Daniel. I really enjoyed our time studying Daniel together. Daniel chapter 2, I always said that Nebuchadnezzar had a bad burrito, got a bad dream. And he wakes up old Daniel, and Daniel tells him about his dream. And essentially, the long and short of it is, there's going to be all these different countries that rise up after you. You think you're really big and powerful and great? Well, somebody else is going to be powerful and great next. And then somebody else. And then somebody else. The kingdoms of the earth are going to rise and fall. But in the days of the Roman Empire, according to Daniel, there's going to be a kingdom that comes up that will never fall. That's the church. That's our kingdom. That's our nation, right? It will never falter. It will last forever. Now, the kingdoms of the earth can and have risen up and down. I love America. I do. As I've said to you, I've worked in government. I am patriotic, and I love this country. I hope may it last forever, and the principles of liberty and freedom for which it stands last and endure. However, countries rise and fall. But the kingdom of God lasts and endures forever. We are Americans, but we have our citizenship in heaven as well. And being a Christian, a pilgrim, a sojourner, is more than getting the right leader in the White House, getting the right judges on the Supreme Court, and the right laws about abortion and marriage. And those things are all worthy goals, but they're temporary things in an eternal mission. I just want to say that because right now it feels like there's a lot of emphasis on government. I love government. I'm interested in it. I've always worked in it. We can't get too distracted by it in our lives because we've got a heavenly kingdom to think about and a heavenly ruler to serve under. Point 2, and this is the main point. This is really what Peter's getting at here. The Christian is to proclaim the excellency of God by his submission to the civil government and to honor its leaders. We're told to submit ourselves to every ordinance of man, whether the king or the governor. We're told to honor all men as the occasion arises. That's sort of how the language I'm given to understand means. Honor all men as the occasion arises. Love the brotherhood continuously. Love the church all the time. And fear God always. But also we are told to honor the king. Now, we obviously don't have a king, but you sort of know what it's being applied to, regardless of the type of governmental structure. We're to accord our civil leaders respect that is due one in a position of authority. Now, I think that amongst most people, there's really no disagreement that the Christian ought to follow the laws of the land. I think we sort of all get that, right? The Christian person ought to not be out doing all sorts of illegal stuff. I think, I don't have to dwell on that very long. But from what I hear, there's a great deal of us, and sometimes myself included, that we need to put a little emphasis on our need to respect our leaders, the people who are in power, whether we like what they are doing or not. As you can tell, this passage doesn't say, well, if you agree with the policies and the philosophical views of the king, honor him. It says, honor the king and be in subject to the king. Now, we better be careful. If we start getting into the stuff about the president and the Congress and we're under a duty. The Christian exclaims the glory of God. One way that we do that is by submitting to the government and honoring and respecting those people in the civil government who were over us. Now, as the media can't say enough, the opinion of government is generally largely negative in this country. 75% of people agree with how the nation is being governed. 69% are at least somewhat angry. 91% of Republicans report being angry with the government. The government is essentially split 50-50 on President Obama's performance. Just 14% of people approve of Congress. And you say, Drew, how can I respect our leaders when they are doing things that are so wrong and so egregious and things that cut against God's word? Now, let me stop you, because don't forget the context in which Peter is telling these people to honor the king. Now, you may not agree with our current leaders, but they were no Nero. Now, that's arguably the time in which Peter is writing. Nero, one of the most wicked and vile emperors in the history of a wicked and vile empire, was engaging in state-sponsored persecution of the church. Nero is believed to have brought about the death of Paul and numerous saints, and yet Peter says here, as Christians, you are to submit to the government and honor the king. That being the wicked and vile, perhaps, Nero. Whether we like or agree with the government or its leaders, that we've got to submit to their authority and honor them. Why? Why are we supposed to do that? Well, first, as all parents can appreciate, because God said so. That's one reason, right? We're told that we are to submit to civil leaders for God's sake, it says. It's the will of God, it says later on, and that ought to be enough. God said to do it, and well, that's the end of it. But God goes, as good parents often do, He goes on to give a reason. You don't like Nero, that's okay. Serve him anyway, submit to him anyway, because I say so. Now, here's another reason why you ought to do it. Reason number 2, because Christians were under scrutiny at this time by the government. I'll just quote you from Brother Guynwood's very good commentary in the Gospel Advocate. A lot of the things that I'm referencing have come from that commentary. He says, quote, instead of indulging in vehement, I don't know how to say that right. There's an H in there that's sort of weird. Angry vindication of their character and conduct, saints to whom Peter wrote were admonished to make their good deeds the most conspicuous feature of their lives. This being the most effective defense against the false and malicious slander that they were suffering at the hands of the enemies. As we talked about before, Christians were admonished to obey the laws, to silence their accusers, so that when they're being blamed for all the wrong stuff that they're saying that Christianity did and caused, then the people don't have a grounds to accuse. Now that language, I like the language silence. That the good works will silence the accusers. My understanding is that what the words there mean is that literally wicked men are being muzzled. And what they're being muzzled by are the good deeds of the saints. Now, people today say a lot of bad things about Christianity. They always have. They always will. But I do wonder that maybe they would say a few less bad things about the saints if our good deeds did a better job of muzzling them. We are told that we ought to have such good works that our good deeds muzzle or silence the accusers here, the governing authority. Third, and a smaller point, we're almost out of time. Obviously, I'm not getting to the end, so I guess Bart will just have to pick it up next time. It's not my class, so he'll just have to figure it out, I guess. But the third thing is Peter talks about here. There is an important role of the civil government, right? Government, 2 Peter 2:14, punish evildoers and praise those who do well. I think our government tries to do a fair bit too much more than that. But that's another reason to respect the civil government is that it has good functions in our life. Now, there are two dangers related to the civil government, and I'm just going to go through those very quickly because we're running out of time. One is that we will use our liberty as a cloak for maliciousness as servants of God. Now, there's in a lot of places, including Galatians, we talk about how we've got liberty in Christ. Liberty from the law, liberty from sin, all of that sort of stuff. Peter encourages us, Paul did, that you ought not to use that liberty to say, well, I don't have to obey anybody. Jesus has saved me, and I'll just do what I please. Peter says, essentially, we can go into more detail, but don't work that way, Hoss. You gotta follow the laws of the land. Now, second, and I think this is an obvious question, but it's not an obvious answer here. What happens when the civil government comes into conflict with our duties under Christ? I mean, right, it just says submit to the government. There's not really an exception here. And so I think somebody might make the argument in this context, well, I mean, if that's what the government says, then you just got to do it because you're told to submit. Now, however, there can be no doubt that there is an exception that does exist. And one reason you can know is flip over to our old friend Acts chapter 4 and 5, where you find this author confronted with that very scenario, right? The civil authorities, there's a little bit of blending between religious and civil authorities there, but civil authorities nonetheless. One of the great sections of Scripture that I love, sort of catch Peter and John and other disciples, and they rough them up and say, don't you be talking about Jesus anymore, right? And then they let them out, or they get let out, and then they get caught teaching about Jesus, and they get before them again and say, didn't we tell you not to be talking about Jesus anymore? Now, in those circumstances, when he and John are standing, and then he before the civil authorities, what does Peter say? Acts chapter 4, beginning in verse 19. Peter, presumably here, speaking with authority, says, but Peter and John answered and said unto them, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you, or God judge you, for we cannot but speak the things that we have seen. Acts 5:29. Then Peter and other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. We are to submit to the civil authorities and to the government until they get up into God's law and contradict with God's law, and then our responsibility is to stand up. Now, in America, aside from all the complaining that we do about it, in this country we've still got things very good. I mean, we still have protections of our free liberty. Whether that goes away or not, I don't know. But for right now, we should be thankful that we've got more ability than the guy who was writing this had to freely express our religion without contravening civil authority. Now, let me just say what's coming up, and I'll apologize here on the record for Bart for not finishing everything, because the next two things, I'd love to talk about the next few things, because there's a great discussion of the Christian servant's responsibility to his master. Many of the folks who are being talked to here are in servitude. And so that presents a really interesting example to us when we're not in servitude, of course. But we are, the old law, if you read old law books, they talk about the servant-master relationship as for employees. That's the second bell. Alas. They talk about the master-servant relationship. And so we're talking about how do you behave at work, essentially. And then there's a great, beautiful discussion of the example of Jesus, and the imagery is given to him as our example, like a handwriting example. You write underneath Jesus to get the right handwriting. And the footsteps of Jesus are things that we follow after in our lives. Sorry, Bart, for not getting to the end, but thank you for your time and attention to being going through 2 Peter. Thanks.